Oh, I did a wedding one time on a little covered bridge at a golf course, and there's a little flowing stream, and then the groom took this nice big fat diamond ring and he bobbled it, and it fell into the stream.
Are you serious?
Yeah, and usually, drop the ring and say, hey, if you drop the ring, just go. We're gonna walk through it, and we'll get it after the service. It's a flowing stream, and all the women
they're all diving in. They all become.
It was like Lord of the Rings, with like the hobbits going down through the lake. Steve, this is Pod Have Mercy. This is Pod Have Mercy. Well, when we started this podcast, this is a Pod Have Mercy. We started this in February of 2020, and it was designed to be conversations around spirituality and faith, kind of outside the walls of the church, that make a difference and intersect into the lives of ordinary kind of people. And this is going to be a fascinating conversation because today we've got Russell Levenson.
And we're in an ordinary place.
We're in an ordinary place. We're going to talk about why we're here.
This is our ordinary place.
This is our ordinary place. And Russ, when he came in, he said, I didn't realize I had to dress up. But I mean, he's the rector here of St. Martin's Episcopal Church in Houston, Texas. Been here since 2007. And this is the church that George H.W. and Barbara Bush have attended, I think, since they moved to Houston in 1960. This was their church.
Over 50 years.
Yeah. Wow. And so when we think about the world and faith and impact and spirituality, Russ has a brand new book coming out. It's going to come out on November the 15th and be released. And I happen to have it, close up, Jeff. It's called Witness to Dignity. And it's about the life and the faith of George H.W. and Barbara Bush. Russ was in their pastor, especially in the latter years of their life. You participated in and helped lead part of George H.W. Bush's funeral, gave the homily, and also did Barbara Bush's funeral. And this book is still pre-order right now as we're taping this.
It is on Amazon and many other.
It's everywhere.
It's out there.
But Russ, I thought it would be.
I'll supply you with a QR code.
We'll have the QR, and we'll have the links in the show notes at the bottom of that. But I thought it would be great to have a conversation around this, because you and I had lunch a while back, and we were talking about their faith and how it intersected in the world they lived in politics, and how it's intersected in all of their lives. But man, I thought in the world that we live in now, with the toxicity around politics and culture, this thing, I think, is really going to be an important resource for us. Tell us about how you just started on this project of Witness to Dignity.
Well, obviously, I appreciate the invitation. I always talk about the churches in this area. Where you and I are both fortunate to serve in this area, and I kind of the Woodway corridor, if you will, out to Memorial, and I think we're all kind of part of the same family between what you all do, Memorial Drive Presbyterian, what Ed Young does up the street at Second Baptist, and what we do here. And I kind of feel like we're connected in a lot of ways. So it's fun to sit down and do this with you here. I really, and I'm give away some of the things that are in the book, but I early on, I did not know if the President and Barbara would be, we'd see them Christmas and Easter. When I first moved here, is that those kind of church people, or would I see them a lot? And so, and what I found quickly is that they were here every week. If they weren't traveling, they weren't ill, they were in church, and they were not just in church; they were active in special events and things like that. But the reason I say that is people, about 6 months in, after I had already a pile of stories, people would say, "Well, are you writing these down?" And I'd say, "No, I really am not. I'm not sure what this relationship will look like." But after 11 and a half years, and particularly the last couple of years of their lives, there were so many moments that were tender and precious and important. And I've kind of thought through it, to be in the University of George and Barbara Bush is an important learning lecture hall, and just by, and again, I chose that title on purpose, just by witnessing their faith lived out in a particular, real, authentic way, that was moving and humbling, and you're right. I think part of the reason was the environment we live in now. I'm a little older than you, so I remember the years that he served in office, and I remember the culture of politics being different then.
Yeah, definitely.
But it really is not a book about that. It is a book about the way in which they lived out their faith. And really, we're 4 years after their deaths and their funerals almost. When we get to December, it'll be 4 years since his. And really, as I was putting together notes and letters and things like that over the last year, I just thought, what do you do with it? You don't throw them away. You don't put them in a binder and keep them in the church office. So I really wanted other people to know the story. So,
That's
and
great.
with the support of the family, and in particular Jeb, who really, he was the one who finally said, "Well, just write it," and they've all read it and gave me the go ahead. So.
Yeah, one of the things that I find interesting, and you sent me a promo, this book has, and I think it says a lot about President Bush and George H.W. Bush and Barbara's lives and who they were. But when you read on sort of the promo sheet for the book, Witness to Dignity, I'm going to say it. I'm going to be really good. I'm going to say it.
Witness to Dignity.
Witness to Dignity. I told Russ to hold it like this. Witness to. We'll talk about the Astros, but he'll be holding the book. But what I found interesting on that sheet is all of these really significant, diverse voices who were speaking in support of this book. I mean, I was thinking about, there was a whole list, but you've got Joe Scarborough from Morning Joe, you've got Neil Cavuto from Fox News, you've got people that served under Bill Clinton, you've got people that served with Bush. You've got all these different voices, and all of these folks are like, this is pretty special. Something about his life and his faith, and I think a lot of people may know or may not. He had a significant experience when he was a pilot in World War II. His plane crashed with his navigator into the ocean, and I think he talked about that a lot as being a very pivotal moment in his spiritual journey. But he was a very faithful man and a kind man, which is one of the things I always. She was spunky.
She was, but I would say they both got they aged well. In their faith. Again, we're living in a time when people seem to have to be beholding to something they said 30 or 40 years ago. Somebody will say, "Russ, you don't remember when George Bush did X, Y, Z," 40 years ago, 30 years ago. And I know a lot of what he did, and I don't portray them as perfect, but I portray them as people who, as we believe, grew in their faith, and they became more perfect. They weren't perfect, but by the end, particularly in this environment in which we are, they just never spoke negatively about anybody, and on either side of the party or whatever, they just were very sweet, and you saw that as a real part of who they were. When he taught, I do think that experience as a young pilot really impacted him, because he jumped out of that plane with two others. The other two ended up dying in that plane crash, missing in action. And when he was pulled from the water, and I kind of go back to this, and it's a story he would tell till right before his death. He would say, I used to say, "Why did God save me? What was the purpose behind this?" He was only 19 at the time. That's amazing. So a lot of 19-year-olds would just say, "Well, I'm glad I got out of the water," and he spent a little bit longer on this submarine that rescued him from the Pacific. I think it was called the Finback. And he said, and they were on other rescue missions then, so they were out in the Pacific while he was on that boat. And as he kind of rumbled through that a lot. Why did God save me? Not why was I saved, but why did God save me? What was the purpose behind that? And there are these poignant moments in his life and his journey that I just kind of pluck out and say, this says a lot about him. So at the end of the war, at the end of World War II, on VE Day, when everybody's celebrating, and he and Barbara basically knew he married, he didn't know if he was going to be called back to action, because that just kind of happened faster than most people thought it would. But he said, we were all celebrating, but then but Barbara and I sought out and found a little church to go pray in on that day, just to thank God that the war was over, and to pray for those who gave their life. But I'm sure they went on with their celebration. But it was important for them to find a church by themselves that day and go in and pray together.
Yeah.
And there, the day after he was elected president, or the election was coming up to his presidency, and he contacted my predecessor, Claude Payne, second rector here, and said, Claude, I think our chances are pretty good. The polls were looking really good, but he did say, and Claude was at a women's luncheon here, and he called and said, I would really like to have a service in the church the day after the election, win or lose. He said, so if I win, I want it to be a Thanksgiving service. If I lose, I want it to be a Thanksgiving service. Mm-hmm. We're going to come together and pray as a nation, pray for our nation, pray for the new president, whoever that's going to be.
Wow.
Can you imagine? And particularly
Today?
This time?
Yeah.
That
would be wonderful. It does. It does.
Yeah.
And of course, it was a slam dunk, but it was first in his mind to do that when he was elected president. At the beginning of his right after he was inaugurated, he said, the first thing I want to do as president is pray. So if you go back to his inaugural speech, it was my first act is to pray. And he offers this beautiful prayer. And that's that consistent theme throughout his life. I mean, we all know politics is blood sport. I mean, it's not a world you and I would.
Well, and he was a politician.
And there's no
too.
politician, politics in the church. Thank God.
No, not at all. we might talk about that on another.
Thank God it's never happened.
Yeah, another episode where I'll do my grief. You can do grief counseling on the United Methodist
or
Church.
trauma counseling.
Yeah, I think that he was a politician.
Yeah.
And I think if you go back and study I love history and you read, like you said, there were things that he did that some people would not agree with, or that wouldn't align with their politics, or maybe they didn't like the decisions he made. But what I'm struck by with you writing this, and really at the end of their lives, how the faith is lifted up. Mm-hmm. And I came across a story or an article that I thought was interesting. And it was a guy who had written something about President George H.W. Bush and his faith, and how you could see it evolve as he was going through politics and everything else. And in 1988, there was a debate in October between him and Michael Dukakis at the time. And one of the questions was about abortion. That's big in the news now too. And you see now how people talk about very difficult conflicts, and it's like we scream at each other, we fight at each other, and so adversarial, there's no sense of dialogue. But the quote was, when they asked him about it, he said, I think human life is very precious. And Dukakis had already talked about he was pro-choice. And he said, and look, this hasn't been an easy decision for me to meet. I know others disagree with it, but when I was in this little church across the river from Washington and saw our grandchild christened in the faith, I was very pleased indeed that the mother had not aborted the child or put the child up for adoption. And then he says, and so I just feel this is where I'm coming from, and it's personal to me. Now, I don't assail Mr. Dukakis on this issue, and I don't assail others on this issue, but this is the way I, George Bush, feel about it. And I'm thinking, man, can you imagine now a debate between presidential candidates?
Where you say, I do not assail my opponent.
Well, they wouldn't use that word.
Know that word.
Well, that's true.
Yeah.
But I just think about how what he did was he made it a very personal thing about his faith, and about the way he viewed the world, and he owned it as his.
Yeah.
But he looked at the guy across from him that he was running against, who had a different position, didn't attack him at all. As a matter of fact, says, I don't fault you, that's your belief, but this is mine. And
There's a generosity
I think
there.
about the way faith shaped him, because one of the things I preach a lot, I'm sure you do, is how we're supposed to love one another.
Right.
And be kind to one another, and be gentle with one another, and have patience with one another. Right. And it always seemed like he had a temperament or something that was the faith and the temperament and the personality and the politician. I would imagine he wrestled a lot, with things.
I think he did. And, this is in part the Episcopal way. I mean, a lot of our theology is we wrestle through our issues around morality and theology, and we try to, we're often called a very big tent. I think the Methodist Church is a very big tent, and that can be frustrating to some people. It's a comfortable tent for me to live in and work in and serve in, and I think that's why they stayed in the Episcopal Church. And George and Barbara stayed in the Episcopal Church. I think they felt as though genuine, authentic love and service was key to being a faithful Christian. And so, and that would supersede any differences on politics they would have. So, look at this incredible friendship he had with Bill Clinton, which is, mystified lots of people. And, but the reason for it was often to go serve, we're going to go attack, the issue after the tsunami and in the Pacific, we're going to work together, politics aside, to do something good for the world, which they did. Yeah. And they got together on the Ike and Gustav, recovery after, all those kinds of things. Yeah. So it's funny to see how, a lot of people kind of raise their eyes and say, how does that work? I think it works because he was a very genuine, caring man.
And how they interacted with one another, no matter where you were on the political spectrum. I mean, you could tell they liked each other.
Yeah, they really did. Yeah,
And there's got to be nowadays it's hard to find that.
Yeah, that's
but
right.
I think a lot about the Apostle Paul talks about the characteristics or the fruit of the Spirit. And again, we're not turning him into Mr. Perfect of all things, but I think that's a part of the struggle. Is we disagree, we struggle with things, but how do we witness in our life? Tell us, what was the most interesting thing that you may have learned or uncovered, or what was something that, as you were writing this or going through the stories, that kind of surprised you or shocked you, or you learned, or just anything?
Yeah, I don't think there was anything that shocked me, because I think particularly the last few years, we just spent a lot of time together, and so it's not pretentious, nor is it. To say we got to know them very well and we considered them friends. And particularly in the last year, there were times when we were at the house more than once a week. And they had a great sense of humor. They had a real tenderness in the way in which they dealt with each other. They loved each other. They held hands. I would come over the house, and if they had slipped into a nap, you'd find them asleep holding hands. I mean,
That's great.
When you reference his demeanor, and we got to know all the children, all the Bush children, and some better than others, and they would say, Dad he was never the one that got mad at it. He was never the angry one. And then they called Barbara the enforcer. They said, Mom took care of that. But Dad would just kind of smile. We'd do something, Dad would just kind of smile and raise his eyebrows. And the way in which I think both of them cared equally for people they encountered. So, we were fortunate to vacation with them in Kennebunkport. They invited our kids up many times. But you would see them interact with everybody. If you're out on the boat, he'd slow down to talk to the lobster fishermen. People joke around the fact that Barbara's over here at Walgreens in Tanglewood pushing a cart and pulling down her medicine and asking people, have you tried this? And one of their favorite restaurants was Yao on the end of Westheimer.
Yeah, it's not. I think it's closed now.
Oh, is it? I checked the other day because I was curious because I wanted to reference it.
I had heard that it might.
But we went there several times with them, and they never made a big deal about coming in. They just came in and sat in the middle of the room. I mean, Secret Service was always around, but if people came up, thank God it was. I think they kind of lived before the age of selfie-ism. People didn't come up and hold up their phones, but people were always really sweet to them. And so I think that if anything surprised me was just the consistent personality with everybody. You never saw him be rude or dismissive or and that was something to behold. I mean, it makes me want to be a better person, better Christian. Whenever you're around somebody that's kind of living into the faith, you kind of go, I need to up my game. Yeah. And there were plenty of times I felt that way.
I was able to be around him a couple of times, not a lot, her more than him. And she was, she had a lot of personality.
She really did, yeah.
And did you ever get to spend any time with them?
No, I never met them. I met their son, but not them. Yeah.
That's another thing I think too is in reading about him, his parents were also very faithful, and his mother was a very faithful and very devout Episcopalian, and would read from the Book of Common Prayer from what I read. So I think it saturates him, and so then when you see the character and the quality of their children. Again, you can agree or disagree on politics and whether you would vote for him or not. But when I watched how Jeb Bush went through the process of running for president, or when you saw George W. Bush, and even now post-presidency, got to know Neil a little bit. But I mean, it's interesting to see the DNA of faith was modeled for them in a sincere way, and you can see it in them. Now, I don't know the grandchildren as well, but that generational faith passing, I think, is really important. When you were preparing for these funerals, what is that like as far as preparing a homily for the service of a former president of the United States?
Well, the service was a massive planning process, and there's a chapter on that, because we knew his service would be at least a 7-day journey. And so for over 11 years, we would have regular meetings here at St. Martin's, sometimes another location, and it would be a meeting of 10 people up to a meeting of 100 people. And there was Secret Service, HPD, people from the city, but all that press and all that kind of stuff that we had to kind of put together. We did not know, of course, she was going to die before he did. And so I hate to put it this way, but we said it a lot. Her funeral was kind of a run through for all the security, because most of the heads of state actually came to her funeral because this was the only service. So we had that kind of run through with her by the time we did his service, and I planned the one for DC and the one here with the family and with other clergy. And the one in D.C. was, of course, in partnership with the National Cathedral, but they were wonderful. They really, when I came to them and I said, here's the service we want, great, we'll just make it happen. There was no pushback or challenges or we don't do it that way, and they knew it was a historic.
Well, they knew you were Episcopalian. Y'all don't really color outside the lines a lot.
A little bit sometimes. But then when we got back here for this service, it was like old home week. I mean, really, I remember walking in through these doors with my wife after we landed in Air Force One, and we got back to the church, and I knew while we were gone everything would be taken care of, and we walked in these doors, and I thought, okay, we're back home. And so that last service was really at home. You feel like we were home. But the homilies were a challenge because he got real sick in 2012, and several of us were tasked with it's time to get ready. And so I wrote a homily that was way too long, and this lands right in the middle of the book. And so I sent it to Secretary Jim Baker, who's a member of the church. And I also got kind of schooled by him in a loving way.
Let me help you edit this.
Yeah, he started by saying, he said, everything's true. These are lovely words. It's way too long. And he said, let me give you some examples. And he talked about his homily, Ronald Reagan's homily, George Bush's homily for Ronald Reagan. And he was like, and he said, you can't be longer. And he said, the president will speak at the service. You can't be longer than the president. I was like, okay, all right. And then, so I said, I kind of got up off the floor, and I kept that letter. It was 2 pages. And then that next Sunday, he came in the back of the church, and he kind of patted me on the shoulder. He said, I hope I wasn't too. And I said, no, sir, that's what I needed to hear. So, but I will say, I knew the job was to honor them and to lift up their faith. Yeah. And so you had a lot of speakers at those services, bump, across the board. But when we got to D.C., I realized, and I had read everybody else's remarks because I'd be last up to bat, and I didn't want to repeat. Yeah. And but I realized I was the only one who did speak about their faith, and I felt like that was my job.
Yeah, I think that's important. Yeah. And I think that's a good part of why the book is going to be helpful for a lot of people. I mean, I'm looking forward to diving into it. I already pre-ordered it.
Oh, did you? Okay. Which you can do.
Yes, which you can do. I pre-ordered it.
I will say there's a fantastic documentary on the life of 41 called Bush 41 Statecraft, or Statecraft, the Bush 41 team, by a historian in Virginia, Lori Sineski, I believe I'm pronouncing her name right. It's 45 minutes. It's fantastic. Takes you from beginning to end. And so you can get it on PBS and whatever. But unbeknownst to me, somebody said, have you seen that documentary? I said, no. They said, well, you need to watch it. It's really good. So I watch it. Well, the last 10 minutes is about the funeral. And it ends with my homily, like 2 or 3 lines from a homily. And what was interesting is they'd been talking about his career and his life and his family, and they get down there, and then they start talking to people about the funeral. Colin Powell, Dan Quayle, Condi Rice, and all of them say, I think Condi Rice starts by saying, oh, and the funeral. And she said, I went over to Angela Merkel and said, will you honor us by being here? She said, of course I would be here. I wouldn't be anywhere else. And then Condi Rice says something like, yeah, I really felt like this was America at its best. And I often said, having been in those 3 funerals and having been in the presence of all these leaders who at times were at odds with each other, I said, for those hours, everybody got along. Yeah. Everybody knew there was something more important. Yeah. And there was this, again, I think I've shared with you, I've not watched the whole funeral. I just still 4 years later, I've watched parts of it, but I haven't sat down and watched it from beginning to end. I will someday, I guess. But somebody said, did you see this interview with Tom Brokaw after the funeral? I said, no, I didn't. I said, well, you need to track this down. So I did. I tracked it down. It's kind of hard to find, but the service in D.C. is over, and they're out front, Brokaw and some other press people, and they're talking about the funeral. But they go immediately to his political career. Here's his, and Brokaw stops and he goes, wait a minute. Oh, did you not just witness what we saw? But this was a service, this was an Episcopal service about his faith.
Man's faith.
Yeah.
And Brokaw kind of tears up and he goes, this is what this moment's about. Wow. And I thought, well, yeah, that's exactly right. And again, I think part of those little moments inspired this story, because there are lots of books written about his incredible, extraordinary career and all that he did in those 4 years, but not a lot written about his faith, which I knew to be real, or hers.
Which in two is what you point out, and I think is important for people to know that, you write all these books on all his political career. He was been around for a long time in politics. Yeah. But sometimes the faith gets lost, and I think that's what we need to focus on again. Is like, what's the character? What makes you what you are? What drives you? What are the core values, right? And it seems like today, it's like I'm not really sure what's driving us. I read a book recently where they said, no longer is it good and evil or right and wrong, but now the highest virtues are winning and losing. And those have become the high core values of our lives. But I don't know that was for him. When he lost, he got a bad deal.
Oh yeah, it was bruising.
It was the biggest third party run, I think, almost. Well, you have to go way back in history. Ross Perot, and he took a big chunk.
He took that chunk.
Big chunk.
If he had not run.
Yeah, because Bill Clinton did not get 50%, over 50% of the vote. So I would imagine that was really hard. Talking about walking through Valley of the Shadow.
And he said, when I got back to Houston, the thing that got me, and he said that was the toughest, other than losing his daughter, which was, but he said, losing that win, he said, but it was my family, my friends, and my faith that got me through.
So. It's amazing just being in this space here and knowing that him taking the Eucharist every week, and when he goes to think about policy, what shaped him was a baptismal of his granddaughter, and to realize that faith formation is not just about going to church, that he was formed in the cruciformed way of Christ because of these symbols and rituals that were a part of his life.
Yeah, and I think it's important to say he didn't. I never observed him using his faith to further his vocation or his career. It informed it. It shaped it. But he never. In fact, there were times when people kind of came in and said, "You need to be a little bit more cozy with this group or that group," and he would say, "No, my faith is my faith," and people see it in different ways, And he was the one who he and Neil both pushed us, invited us. They had the 20th anniversary of the Points of Light Foundation, and it was going to be here in Houston. They'd never had an event. And so Neil came and said, I think it'd be great if we did an interfaith service to start that off.
Mm-hmm.
And were you part
I was
of it?
here. Yeah.
And so I thought you were. And
it was great because all the religions
we had, with Muslims
represented. Yeah,
and then there were groups that were conservative that thought, we should. When another group found out that by the time we got through, it was everybody was right back here.
I know. Yeah, I remember.
Muslims, Jews, Christians, Buddhists. I mean, we had it all. But we did tell nobody could preach. That was the only thing.
I thought y'all had great costumes, but the Buddhist, priests
and they sang.
They did sing. They did.
Oh, wow.
And then John Meacham preached. But again, that was they had never done. They'd never opened. I think people were kind of, why are we doing this? And then. But it was a great get together.
It meant a lot to them.
It did. That their church
was doing that. I remember that.
Yeah.
Had lunch with him at the Forest Club one time we were preparing for that.
Yeah,
and we're about 20, or it was a small group.
Yep. But I do remember that.
He came in a little late, but she was kind of holding court with everybody in there.
Right.
Fascinating people, and I just, I just long for. What do we do to get back to civility? And now that you've written this book, it's Witness to Dignity.
The prescription?
What do you glean from this that could be things that would help us, or maybe lessons we need to learn, or maybe reclaim?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about this. You and I are troubled, as are many people. Even if you don't want to name it, people are troubled about the way we're speaking with each other. Even I'm going to step away from our faith for a moment and just say, Secretary Baker, who is as active as the Bushes were, very in church every week and very supportive and very active, told me the story of after President Reagan was shot, and he went up to his hospital room during the little stay, and the only person, I mean, there were lots of people kind of in and out, that kind of thing, but at one point he came in, the only person sitting with him was Tip O'Neill, the Democratic Speaker of the House, holding President Reagan's hand and weeping, saying, "Mr. President, Mr. President, Mr. President." I mean, that says a lot. I mean, where are those days? You and you and I are in a different business than that business. Yeah. But if you're going to be a Christian who enters that realm, then you need to be informed and sustained by your prayer life and by what the scriptures say. And you can't read 1 Corinthians 13 and be not moved to treat others with civility.
Yeah.
You can't read the epistles of John. You can't read. I'm real right now, and you and I've had this discussion about our church worlds that seem to be upended right now. That you can't read Jesus' prayer in Gethsemane right at the end of John.
That's right.
Where he says, I pray that we're all one.
Yeah.
And that's how, I'm always struck by, this is his last prayer other than what happens on the cross. And in that prayer in Gethsemane, when he says, I pray that everybody who follows me would be one, as you and I are one, so that the world may know. They are my disciples. How does the world know you're my disciples? We work toward unity. I mean, that was, he didn't say what position they took on abortion, what church they go to, what what they wear, he said, this is how people will know.
Yeah.
If they're one, like you and I are one. And I think, I say right at the end of the book, I do say, I think a lot of us, perhaps in the same way some people felt about Queen Elizabeth's death.
Yeah.
Nostalgic. And nostalgia is great. You kind of think, oh yeah, I remember those days. But nostalgia can also be an inspiration to make us go, oh, wait a minute. Does nostalgia not mean that we could do that again? So, my prayer really right now is that God would raise up people who inspire character and dignity and decency. And that's a tall order, but we're people of prayer, and I think that's what
and people of hope and redemption.
I think we had Max Lucado in several weeks ago, and he told a great little story before he left, and he talked about how everybody right now is talking about the need to change the world and make it a better place and make it, and that we need a revival. And he kind of walked us through this history lesson of revivals, and which he said, most revivals were not human inspired. It was just this moment that God decided, the Great Awakening. God decided, pop, we're gonna have a revival now, but it was God doing it. And he said, you can't like make it happen on your own. You can't make it happen without God. And he talked about the old guy in his house one night fretting over the way the world in which he was living was going. And he said, well, God, we need a revival. And he got up off his knees, went outside, drew a circle in his yard. And he said, Lord, I pray for a revival. And may it begin with everyone standing in this circle. And so, start here.
Yeah.
What am I doing to promote unity, decency, dignity? What am I doing to live out my faith in a real way? And but I'm not sure, as you, I'd love to see more leaders who start that way. And I think 41 and Barbara did that faithfully.
Yeah, to see people who value that in both parties, and people that are a culture that's willing to embrace it and vote for it again. Yeah. At some point, it seems like to me the pendulum swings in history. And we're going through a really difficult, uncivil season. Yeah. But I'm hopeful that it'll swing back.
I believe in prayer. I don't stop praying for that to happen.
I just think this is a great. I hope that folks will check this out. Witness to Dignity: The Life and Faith of George H.W. and Barbara Bush, by the Russell J. Levenson Jr.
Thank you.
Do you get to be in the Episcopal Church? Y'all get like these fancy titles, like the very right.
Only if you're elected bishop are you the right reverend. The very are deans of cathedrals, and but I'm very happy here. So my title will remain.
Whenever somebody says, "Don't you want to run for a bishop?" I think of that movie, Talladega Nights, where he says, "Don't you put that evil on me, Ricky Bobby."
That's right.
Don't you put that evil on me. Well, this has been a great conversation. Thanks so much for taking time with us.
Thanks for having me.
And I'm John Stevens.
I'm Matt Russell.
And I'm Russ Levenson.
Of course you are. And this is Pod Have Mercy.